Imagine a busy street, engines roaring, people going about their business. Now add to this picture a horrible moment that will make you freeze. A man, full of hatred, rudely insults an elderly woman, right in front of passers-by. But that wasn't enough. He pushed her so hard that she ended up on the edge of the road. For a split second everything frozy when a heavy truck came within centimeters of her. Her heart stopped, terror and fear filled the air. But the most shocking thing happened later. The man did not know who the woman's son was. When he learned the truth, he regretted what he had done so much that his life changed forever. Write in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching this video from. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. You are incredibly important to us and help our channel grow and reach new heights. Thank you for your support. It inspires us to create such stories. Enjoy the show. It was a hot summer evening. The busy street in the city center, where an endless stream of cars filled the road, was full of people going about their business. Cars honked their horns, shouting at each other, and vendors on the corners busily advertised their products. The air was saturated with a mixture of exhaust fumes, fried food, and countless voices blending into a single background noise. Amidst the chaos, an elderly woman named Martha Wilson walked carefully toward the crosswalk. She was carrying a small bag of groceries and looked a little tired, but she had a look of resilience in her eyes. Martha was used to the hustle and bustle of big cities, and she was able to keep her dignity despite her advanced age. At this time, a man named Jack Connor stood on the opposite side of the street. His rough facial features and intense gaze betrayed irritation. In his early 40s, he had a sturdy build and a sense of menacing strength. Jack was a man who always felt superior to others, especially those he considered not like him. His gaze fell on Martha as she came to the edge of the road, waiting for a traffic signal. Her dark skin gave him the spark of anger that had long been a part of his personality. "There they go again," Jack muttered under his breath, clenching his fist dismissively. Martha, not noticing the angry stare, continued to stand, watching the changing signals. At that moment, Jack took a few steps toward her. His irritation gradually turned to visible contempt, as if someone else had overstepped his personal boundaries. The crowd around them did not notice the impending conflict. People walked by without looking at each other, each absorbed in his own concerns. But for Jack, this scene had already become the stage for his inner anger, which he decided to unleash on the defenseless old woman. This evening, a busy street will witness a horrifying incident that starts with just a look of hatred. Jack stopped only a few feet away from Martha. His eyes threw sparks of anger, as if her presence in itself offended him. At first, he spoke softly enough for only her to hear. "Gee, do the likes of you have a place on our streets?" he hissed with a wry grin, looking down at her. Martha tensed when she heard his voice. She turned her head slowly and met his gaze. There was no anger or fear in her eyes, only surprise. She was used to such attacks in her long life, but every time it hurt her. Jack, noticing her reaction, got a taste of power. He stepped closer, an eerie grin on his face. He spoke louder now, so that those around him could hear. "What are you doing here? You think you're needed here? You've already overrun the whole country. Don't you belong where you came from?" Martha gripped the strap of her bag tighter, trying not to show how hurt she was by those words. She took a step back, but Jack didn't back down. His voice grew louder and louder, becoming a scream that the passers-by began to notice. "Look at her, the old witch. She's probably on welfare, and we're paying for it," he shouted, looking around the crowd for support. "How long can we put up with people like her?" A few people turned around, hearing his words. Some quickened their steps, not wanting to interface, but there were others who stopped to watch the show unfold. Jack could feel his hatred turning into a spectacle for the crowd, and it only fueled him. Martha felt a chill run down her spine. Her heart beat faster, but she tried not to show her fear. She lifted her head, looking at him with dignity. "I haven't done anything wrong to you," she said quietly. "Why do you say that?" The words only made Jack angrier. His face reddened with anger, and he stepped closer, so that there were only a few centimeters between them. "Nothing wrong," he repeated with a sneer. All of you are harming this country with your presence. All you do is take away our jobs, our money, our lives." Martha looked away, trying to find someone in the crowd to help her, but people just stared, some with sympathy, others with indifference. No one intervened. "You're strangers here, and you always will be," Jack shouted, waving his arms, as if trying to silence any attempt to object. His voice rang like a clap of thunder as it rolled down the street. Martha felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held back. Fear, humiliation, and pain mingled in her soul. She knew she shouldn't show weakness, but his words cut like a knife. The crowd around her began to thicken, and the tension in the air grew with every passing moment. Jack, like a predator, savored her helplessness. He felt strong and powerful, watching her struggle to withstand his attacks, but he didn't know that this evening would change everything, and his triumph would turn against him in the most unexpected way. Martha took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. She realized that this man was filled with hatred and anger, but she wasn't going to back down. Her voice was steady, but it had a note of sadness and determination in it. "Young man," she said, trying to speak calmly, "don't you think you're being a little rude? I haven't done anything to you. I'm just passing by like everyone else." Jack grinned, as if her words only confirmed his superiority. He moved even closer, almost hovering over her. "Too rough." His voice was venomous. "Look, Grandma, your tone isn't going to change anything here. You think if you speak politely, people like me will turn a blind eye to who you are? No, I'll tell you what I think. People like you shouldn't be here." Martha straightened up, meeting his gaze. Despite her fear, she was determined to show him that she wasn't going to give in to his aggression. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know what I went through to get here. I've worked honestly all my life, like so many others. Why do you let yourself judge me just by the way I look?" Her words sounded unexpectedly firm, but instead of quieting Jack, they caused a new outburst of rage. He burst into laughter, filled with contempt. "Ew, working?" He almost shouted it, looking around the crowd. "Ridiculous. All you do is drag us all down. Look at you. Who gave you the right to stand here and tell me about your hard life?" His words struck like a whip. Martha tried to hold on, but her hands began to shake slightly. She took a step back, hoping he'd back off, but Jack only followed her, his voice growing louder. "Don't you dare cross me," he shouted, pointing his finger at her. "People like you think they can get away with anything, but I'm here to tell you the truth. The crowd around them began to thicken. People could not ignore the unfolding conflict. Some people were filming on their phones, but no one intervened. Only a few people whispered to each other, expressing shock, but no one dared to stand up for the elderly woman. "I'm not afraid of your hatred," Martha said, raising her head. Her voice shook a little, but it was still dignified. "And I won't let you make me feel less than I am." The words seemed to make Jack lose his temper. His face reddened, and his eyes filled with anger. He stepped forward, almost to Martha's side. "Aren't you afraid?" he hissed. "Well, then I'll show you what you have to be afraid of." His arm swung to his side, a gesture that was both threatening and humiliating. His screams echoed down the street, causing those around him to gasp in horror. Martha pressed her lips together, her breathing quickening. She realized that words would not help. The man was like a madman, consumed by his own hatred, and every response she made only added fuel to the fire. The crowd around them was silent, their inaction deepening the sense of isolation and danger. This moment was a turning point. The conflict was no longer just a verbal altercation, it was turning into something darker and more threatening. Jack was no longer in control of himself. His voice grew louder, his words more violent and hateful. His face was twisted with anger, his hands clenched into fists as if he were preparing for a fight. "You are all the problem of this city, of this country," he shouted, looking directly at Martha, but as if he were addressing the whole world. "All you do is ruin everything around you. Work, who needs you? All your places should have been cleared for normal people a long time ago." Martha tried to keep her composure, but her legs were shaking. The crowd around them was getting visibly nervous. Some of the passers-by began shouting at Jack, trying to quiet him. "Hey, man, calm down. What are you doing?" shouted one of the men, tall and stout, standing nearby. He had a look of indignation on his face. "Are you out of your mind?" "It's just an old woman," added a young woman with a stroller, who had stopped a little further away from what was happening. But the words of the bystanders only fueled Jack's rage. He turned to the man who had first dared to intervene and pointed his finger at him. "None of your business." "Okay," he snarled, practically growling. "You don't even know what you're talking about. These people are destroying us, and if no one speaks up, everything goes to hell." The crowd began to grow thicker, people flanking them on all sides. Some took out their phones, recording what was happening. Others tried to shout Jack down. The noise grew louder and louder, and the tension in the air increased. "Stop it," said another woman loudly, an older woman, but with a firm and confident voice. "That's just disgusting. How can you talk like that to someone who has done nothing to you?" "You don't understand," Jack shouted, waving his arms as if he were trying to justify himself to the crowd. "You're all just blind. She and her kind are the cause of all our troubles." Jack's words became even more rude and humiliating. He started shouting about how their place is on the margins of society, blaming them for all the country's ills. His voice was full of anger and contempt, and his tone was threatening. Martha finally raised her hand, as if asking for silence. Her voice was weak, but it was firm. "That's enough. I won't let you talk to me or about my family like that. Your words won't change who I am, but they show who you are." Jack laughed, but there was tension in his laughter. He stepped forward, but at that moment a man from the crowd stepped forward, stepping between Jack and Martha. "Enough," he shouted. "You've crossed the line." His harsh tone made Jack freeze for a second. The crowd around him began to shout, some supporting the man, some shouting words of encouragement to Martha. The tension was at its peak. "If you don't stop, we'll call the police," said the young woman with the phone in her hand, holding it so Jack could see that it was being filmed. Jack bit his lip, his eyes darting around the crowd. Now he felt control of the situation slipping away, but instead of backing away, he threw the latest humiliation aimed at Martha with redoubled vigor. "You're all just a bunch of cowards," he shouted, glaring at those who dared to contradict him. "Do you think you understand anything? You're just like her, just as weak." The situation had gotten extremely heated. The crowd began to surround Jack more closely, people shouting, arguing, and some had already called the police. Jack looked around, realizing that he was outnumbered, but his face still showed rage and resistance. The conflict could no longer be stopped. It was moving toward its climax, where words would turn into actions that would leave an unforgettable mark. The crowd was thickening, but not everyone present dared to intervene. Some people were clearly disturbed by the situation, but fear and reluctance to get involved with the aggressive Jack paralyzed them. They lowered their eyes, turned away, pretended not to notice. As to stay out of it, the man in the business suit whispered to his companion, "This guy looks dangerous. Why risk it? Maybe someone else will intervene." The woman beside him said, clutching her bag tighter to her chest. Her eyes flickered toward Martha, but she looked away, as if it were enough to convince herself of her own innocence. Others just kept walking, pretending that everything that was happening was none of their business. A young couple, passing by, quickened their pace, the girl muttering to her companion, "Please, let's just go. It's not our problem." Martha, noticing how many people were turning away, felt a heaviness growing in her chest. It seemed that even the people around her, who could have supported her, preferred to leave her alone against this hatred. "You're all just standing there," shouted an elderly woman from the crowd, trying to rouse the others. "Don't you see what's happening?" But her words were drowned in the general rumble. Most people preferred not to interface, fearing that Jack's aggression might fall on them as well. Jack, seeing so many people just watching or walking away, grew even more bold. He laughed, glaring angrily at those who stood silently by. "Exactly," he shouted. "No one wants to get behind her because they all know I'm right." His words echoed down the street, as if he were trying to convince himself and the others of his power. He felt that the indifference of the others only strengthened his position. Martha looked at those who turned away, who quickened their steps or simply stood aside. Her eyes filled with sadness. She knew that many of these people probably sympathized with her, but their silence was like a knife in the back. The crowd that could have been her defense became mere passive witnesses to her humiliation. Her helplessness increased with each indifferent look, with each passing person. However, amidst this silence, a spark of resistance began to brew. Not everyone was ready to just stand by and watch. Some had already begun to raise their voices. Some had called the police, and although most stayed away, the tension in the crowd was growing. This mixture of fear, indifference, and the first glimmers of confrontation made it feel like something was about to happen. The tension seemed to have reached its climax. Jack, not receiving the obedience he had expected, and realizing that those around him were in no hurry to interface, had crossed a line beyond which there was no return. His face twisted with anger, his eyes filled with hatred. "You still dare to contradict me?" he shouted, waving his arms. "You think you can stand there like you're entitled to something?" Martha took another cautious step back, but her heels were already touching the edge of the sidewalk. She raised her hands, trying to defend herself, but that only made Jack angrier. "Enough," she exclaimed. "You can't treat me like this." "I can't." His voice became almost a growl. "We'll see." The next second, he shoved her roughly with both hands. It happened so fast that Martha didn't even have time to react. Her body staggered, and she collapsed to the sidewalk, hitting her side on the concrete sidewalk. There was a thud as she fell, followed by a sharp cry of pain. The crowd shuddered, as if awakening from a trance. A few people gasped, and someone shouted, "Are you out of your mind?" Martha lay on the ground, her face contorted in pain. She pressed her hand to her side where the blow had struck. But that wasn't the worst part. Her head was only inches from the edge of the sidewalk, where a stream of cars was moving behind her. The squeal of tires was so loud that many people's hearts stopped. One of the trucks passing by braked sharply, smoke billowing from under its wheels. The truck stopped only a few centimeters away from Martha. "Oh my God!" She almost got hit by a car. A young girl in the crowd shouted, clutching her head. Some people rushed over to her, trying to help her up, but before anyone could get to her, Martha slowly pulled herself up, clenching her teeth in pain. Her gaze rose to Jack, who frowned as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. "What have you done?" one of the passers-by asked loudly, coming closer. "You could have killed her," another woman shouted, trembling with indignation. But Jack didn't answer right away. His face was frowning in a mixture of anger and confusion. Perhaps for the first time, he was beginning to realize that the situation was out of his control. But instead of apologizing or retreating, he took a step back, trying to justify himself. It was her own fault, he shouted, his voice sounding uncertain now. "She doesn't belong here, and I wanted her to understand." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. People surrounded Martha, some of them lifting her to her feet, some of them calling the police, some of them yelling at Jack, accusing him of cruelty. "It was an attack," said the tall man, the same one who had tried to calm Jack down earlier. "You're going to have to answer for this." Jack started to back away, but with each passing second, he found it harder and harder to ignore the anger and contempt of those around him. The crowd was no longer silent, and a barrage of condemnation came at him. Martha was helped to step aside, away from the roadway. Her face was in pain, but she tried to hold on despite the tears that streamed down her cheeks. Her quiet, trembling voice cut through the noise of the crowd. "You think strength is about humiliating the weak, but strength is something else entirely, and you'll never understand that." Her words silenced a lot of people, but Jack only laughed evilly. He didn't realize that this night would change everything in his life, and the reckoning was at hand. That events unfolded with lightning speed, as if the whole world had frowning, leaving only chaos and fear. After Jack's push, Martha, who had not yet regained her balance, felt her feet slipping off the curb. Her body lurched forward, and she fell to her knees on the asphalt of the roadway. A sharp pain pierced her, but it was nothing compared to the feeling of terror that gripped her when she heard the deafening roar of the engine. "No!" shouted someone in the crowd, trying to get through to the truck driver, who was speeding forward. Martha raised her head. Her eyes met the headlights of a truck approaching her at an alarming speed. The light blinded her, and she instinctively covered her eyes with her hands. "God save me," she whispered, before a scream of terror escaped her throat. The truck's brakes squealed, rubber squealed from under the wheels, and the air was filled with the smell of burnt rubber and carbon monoxide. The whole thing seemed endless, each moment stretching into eternity. The driver, seeing the woman right in front of the car, swerved the steering wheel. The truck skidded, its massive body passing within a few centimeters of Martha. The impact of the brakes caused the rear wheels to bounce, and the truck came to a stop with a deafening rumble. The crowd in the street frowned. Some covered their mouths with their hands. Others closed their eyes, not daring to look at what was about to happen. But when the tire smoke cleared, it was clear that the truck had not hit her. Martha lay on the pavement, her whole body shaking. Her eyes remained tightly closed, and her face showed shock and fear. "Is she alive?" whispered someone in the crowd. A young fellow from the nearest observers rushed toward her, exclaiming, "Ma'am, are you okay? Can you stand up?" Martha slowly unclenched her hands, pulling them away from her face. She couldn't speak, only gasped for air. Her heart was racing, and her eyes were full of tears. It was him," she whispered, barely audible. Her gaze rose toward Jack. Meanwhile, Jack stood still, pale as a ghost, For the first time in ages, he looked lost and frightened. The event had knocked the ground out from under him, and now he was looking at the crowd, at the truck, at Martha, as if he couldn't believe it had happened. "It wasn't me," he began, stepping back. "It was her." His words sounded pathetic and uncertain. The crowd was no longer silent. Condemnation and indignation exploded in shouts around him. "You almost killed her," the woman with the phone, still filming the scene, shouted. "The police are on their way," the other man added, pointing toward the street. Martha still couldn't get up. The young man who came first helped her to her feet. She struggled to stand, leaning on his arm, but her gaze remained steady despite the shock. "You think you've won?" she said quietly, looking at Jack. "But the real power isn't in hate, and you'll learn that soon enough." The words, spoken shakily but firmly, hung in there. The crowd frowned in anticipation. The police were on their way, and Jack was beginning to realize that his world was crumbling before his eyes. Martha stood on the sidewalk, leaning on the arm of the young man who had helped her up. Her heart was still racing, and fear was weighing down on her chest like a heavy burden. She couldn't understand what had happened, but one thing was certain: she had almost died. The crowd around them was raging. People were screaming. Some were running around looking for help. Others were calling the police. "Hold on, don't worry, help is coming," a woman shouted, approaching Martha with a medical kit in her hands. She hurriedly began to examine her, despite the worry that was still on her face. "Calm down. You're fine. Just get some rest," the other woman said, supporting Martha by the shoulders. But despite the attempts to help, almost all eyes were fixed on Jack, standing at the edge of the crowd. He didn't move, as if he wasn't part of the scene, but his grin grew more and more sinister. He stood staring at Martha without the slightest regret. His eyes burned with a vicious confidence. Even when several people rushed toward him, accusing him of nearly killing the woman, he didn't move. His face remained calm, even though the crowds around him were shouting. "So what?" he shouted contemptuously, waving his hand. "Nothing fatal. It's just a grandmother. She'll be all right." His voice was cold but sharp, as if he were talking about something insignificant, something that deserved neither attention nor regret. He was sure that no one would dare to stand against him. However, his words only added fuel to the fire. Some of the passers-by began to approach him, not hiding their indignation. A woman who was standing next to Martha almost shouted at him, "Are you out of your mind? You just pushed her into the road. She could have died. You all just don't understand." Jack started to justify himself, but his voice shook as he noticed the people around him starting to whisper and point fingers. She had put herself in this situation. If she hadn't acted like that, none of this would have happened. He looked back at the crowd, his gaze sliding over people's faces, full of judgment and fear. It was like a trap from which he could never escape. People were no longer silent observers, they were now active participants, rage on their faces. Jack, however, showed no fear. Instead of walking away, he continued to stand, grinning contemptuously. It seemed to him that his aggression, his confidence and defiance were all stronger than any threats. He was sure of his superiority. "It's not your problem. Get out," he said, raising his voice again. "You're all just rags. You don't understand anything." But his words had lost their force. The police were coming, and with every step they took toward him, the feeling of dread grew. There was nothing but hatred and condemnation in the eyes of those around him, which were looking at him more and more. As the policeman got out of the car and approached Jack, his confidence began to crack. They surrounded him without further ado, silencing him when one of them spoke quickly. "Take it easy, man. We'll talk to you." And in that moment, Jack, realizing for the first time the gravity of his situation, felt his world crumbling. He was no longer aggressive, no longer sure of his impunity. He just stood there, trying to find some justification for his actions. The noise around that incident gradually subsided when a luxurious black car arrived at the scene. The door opened and a man in an expensive suit stepped out of the car, his confident posture and quick steps attracting everyone's attention. It was Martha's son Alexander. He was a man who knew how to remain calm in the most tense situations, and when he saw what had happened, his face instantly turned stony. He exhaled, assessing the scene. His mother, still shaken, stood with support. A few people fussing around her, and the man standing a little away was clearly trying to maintain his self-respect. Though there was confusion in his eyes, Alexander didn't hesitate. He made his way through the crowd, heading resolutely toward the woman who was helping his mother. He didn't say a word, but glancing at her condition, he quickly took her under his arm. "Mom, how are you?" His voice was strained but restrained. Martha tried to smile, but her face expressed only terror and weakness. "I'm fine, son. It's just, it was all so fast. I don't understand." Her voice was shaking. Alexander nodded, wasting no time talking. He knew that every moment mattered right now. He turned and headed toward Jack, who was still standing with a smirk, as if he didn't realize the hellish position he was in. "Do you realize what you've done?" Alexander asked coldly, his eyes drilling the aggressor. Jack frowned. His face began to pale as he realized who he was facing. This was not a man to be trifled with. Alexander staggered toward him with each step, and his presence was like a cold shower for Jack. He could feel a weight descending on him, and his confidence began to melt. "You're nothing," Alexander continued without raising his voice, but every word sounded like a sentence. "You almost killed my mother. I can send you to jail for the rest of your life. Do you understand that?" Jack tried to justify himself, but his words sounded unconvincing. "It's her own fault. She provoked me." His voice trembled, but there was still an angry certainty in his eyes. Alexander didn't listen to him. He took out his phone and dialed a number. "Ambulance. Now. My mother. She's hurt. We need to see her immediately." He said this with such determination that the operator, without asking any questions, acknowledged the call and said that help was on the way. Then he turned to Jack again. His gaze became icy, his stiffness and calmness raising all the stakes of the game. "You're finished," he said. "I'm not going to let you just walk away. You'll pay for this." Jack stood, now unsure of what to do. A fear he hadn't felt before began to seep into his gaze. Alexander wasn't just his mother's son, he was a man who could destroy everything Jack had ever built. Meanwhile, other people continued to whisper restlessly, waiting to see what would happen next. The crowd was divided. Some whispered about how Alexander would resolve the conflict, while others raised questions about justice. But at that moment, everyone knew one thing for Jack: his moment of reckoning had come. Alexander stood directly in front of Jack, his face calm, but behind that calmness, there was a threat that he was carefully hiding. Everything around him frowned in anticipation. The street was filled with noise, but for Jack at that moment, there was only Alexander, this man in an expensive suit, with a gaze so cold it seemed he could freeze the air around him. Alexander raised his hand and slowly pushed back the cuffs of his suit, making it clear that he hadn't come here to waste time on idle conversation. His voice was measured, but so confident that it silenced Jack and made him listen. "Do you think you can just push people down the road, humiliate them because you felt like it? You think your anger and hatred went unnoticed?" His words penetrated my mind like a hammer hitting stone. Jack shook his head nervously, but his eyes darted from one person to another. The crowd huddled around him, and every glance directed at him seemed to drive 1,000 jabs into his soul. Alexander continued. He was calm, but there was such power in his voice that Jack was literally restrained. He no longer looked as confident and aggressive as he had a few minutes ago. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Alexander said quietly, but his words echoed throughout the crowd. "You're dealing with a man who can bring your life down like a house of cards. My influence extends far and wide, and I always get what I want. You blindly confronted someone you shouldn't have confronted." Jack shook his head, trying to figure out what was going on, but his attempts to find an excuse faded into fear. His gaze slid to the people standing around him, and he saw how some of them, even those who had been silent before, now began to whisper, as if his identity had immediately become a troubling topic of discussion. Alexander stepped closer, his footsteps sounding on the pavement like those of a man long accustomed to power and confident in his position. "You have no idea how many people I can affect with one word," he continued, not letting Jack avoid his gaze. "Do you think you'll escape the consequences? You think your behavior will just go away?"
Jack stepped back, his face contorted in fear. He felt his world crumbling, as if a chasm had opened up in front of him and he was on the edge. Each of Alexander's next steps brought him closer to the moment when Jack realized that this man was not to be trifled with. "I will make you regret this day for the rest of your life," Alexander added, his voice hard and determined. "Your actions will have consequences you can't stop." Jack stood like a hunted animal now, his eyes empty of confidence, only confusion and fear. He realized slowly that he was up against a man who possessed not only physical strength, but a power that no one could dare argue with. Alexander took a step back and looked at those around him. Everyone froze, watching the moment unfold. The crowd was tense. They saw how the man who had once seemed the aggressor was now fully aware that his actions had led to disaster. Martha's son didn't give him time to justify himself. He turned and addressed Jack again, his voice as cold as ice. "You've talked so much about your right to do whatever you want. Well, now you'll learn what it means to violate the rights of those who can make your life a living hell. Get out of here before I decide what to do with you. But know this, you will not be forgiven." Jack, unable to continue resisting, backed away slowly. His steps were timid, uncertain. He realized that all that was left was to leave. Alexander watched silently as the man disappeared into the crowd, and only then, when his silhouette was gone, did he turn to his mother. Immediately, without further ado, he hugged her. "It's going to be all right, Mom," he said, and there was so much confidence in his words that Martha felt her fear begin to recede. When Jack, still reeling from the unbearable fear, walked to his car, his face was pale. He couldn't understand what had just happened, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. He replayed Alexander's words over and over in his head, his threats, his cold stare that penetrated to the bone. Jack knew that the moment he'd pushed the woman, he'd lost everything he had. He stood there, trembling with fear, trying to find some excuse for his actions. But as soon as his gaze fell on Martha's silhouette, standing next to her son, he realized there was no fixing this. He couldn't believe his aggression had led to this. Nervously lighting a cigarette, Jack was silent for a few seconds. Then, suppressing a shiver, he suddenly approached Alexander, who was standing with his mother and talking to the policeman. "Hey, listen," Jack almost whispered, his voice much quieter than it had been before. He sounded unsure and weak. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would end this way. I'm sorry, I was wrong." Alexander didn't turn immediately. He was still talking to the policeman, but his face was clearly displeased. Jack repeated his words again, more insistently. "Look, I apologize, okay? I was aggressive, and I know it's wrong. I'm sorry, please." He paused, noticing Alexander's eyes slowly sliding in his direction. Jack's apology, however, sounded flat, almost like that of a pathetic man trying to twist himself around and avoid responsibility. The words couldn't hide the fact that he wasn't sincere, but simply afraid of the consequences. Alexander stopped, his gaze impenetrable. He met his gaze, and in that instant Jack felt a chill go through him. "You think you can apologize that easily?" Alexander asked, his voice calm, but with that heavy force that was impossible to ignore. "You pushed my mother into the road, nearly killing her. Are you sure apologizing is going to help here?" Jack opened his mouth, but found no words. He could only stand silently in front of him, feeling his apology sound like nothing in the air. It was too late. All his attempts seemed futile. "You will realize how hard it will be for you to pay for this deed," Alexander continued, his face still cold, but his eyes burning brightly. "Believe me, you will not escape the consequences. This isn't just an accident, and I'm not going to let it go." Jack recoiled, his heart clenched. He was sure the situation was out of control, but he still hoped that if he... Alexander watched silently as the man disappeared into the crowd, and only then, when his silhouette was gone, did he turn to his mother. Immediately, without further ado, he hugged her. "It's going to be all right, Mom," he said, and there was so much confidence in his words that Martha felt her fear begin to recede. When Jack, still reeling from the unbearable fear, walked to his car, his face was pale. He couldn't understand what had just happened, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. He replayed Alexander's words over and over in his head, his threats, his cold stare that penetrated to the bone. Jack knew that the moment he'd pushed the woman, he'd lost everything he had. He stood there, trembling with fear, trying to find some excuse for his actions. But as soon as his gaze fell on Martha's silhouette, standing next to her son, he realized there was no fixing this. He couldn't believe his aggression had led to this. Nervously lighting a cigarette, Jack was silent for a few seconds. Then, suppressing a shiver, he suddenly approached Alexander, who was standing with his mother and talking to the policeman. "Hey, listen," Jack almost whispered, his voice much quieter than it had been before. He sounded unsure and weak. I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would end this way. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Alexander didn't turn immediately. He was still talking to the policeman, but his face was clearly displeased. Jack repeated his words again, more insistently. Look, I apologize, okay? I was aggressive, and I know it's wrong. I'm sorry, please. He paused, noticing Alexander's eyes slowly sliding in his direction. Jack's apology, however, sounded flat, almost like that of a pathetic man trying to twist himself around and avoid responsibility. The words couldn't hide the fact that he wasn't sincere, but simply afraid of the consequences. Alexander stopped, his gaze impenetrable. He met his gaze, and in that instant Jack felt a chill go through him. You think you can apologize that easily? Alexander asked, his voice calm, but with that heavy force that was impossible to ignore. You pushed my mother into the road, nearly killing her. Are you sure apologizing is going to help here?
Jack opened his mouth, but found no words. He could only stand silently in front of him, feeling his apology sound like nothing in the air. It was too late. All his attempts seemed futile. You will realize how hard it will be for you to pay for this deed. Alexander continued, his face still cold, but his eyes burning brightly. Believe me, you will not escape the consequences. This isn't just an accident, and I'm not going to let it go. Jack recoiled, his heart clenched. He was sure the situation was out of control, but he still hoped that if he apologized, he could somehow get away with it. He trembled with fear and helplessness. I didn't know who you were, he said, feeling the force of his words fade. I didn't know you were such an important person. I didn't know there would be such a problem. Alexander gritted his teeth. He had been restrained, but there was not only contempt in his eyes now, but cold determination. He didn't need to apologize. He knew the consequences wouldn't be long in coming. Your indiscretion has cost you too much, Jack. You don't realize how wrong you were, but you will soon. I'll make sure you get everything you deserve, Alexander said, not giving me a chance for further excuses. Jack felt his face redden with shame. He couldn't say a word. All his confidence was gone, replaced only by fear. He stood there like a hunted animal, realizing he couldn't climb out of this hole. Alexander nodded briefly and turned back to his phone, addressing his lawyers and police officers. Jack looked at him again, but this time his gaze was filled not with contempt, but with horror. He realized that if he ever encountered this man again, his life would be ruined. He lowered his head and began to back away slowly. His heart was beating with such force that fear seemed to flood him. Alexander stood, unhurried, watching Jack, who, shocked and pathetic, was backing away, trying to escape the consequences of his actions. He still couldn't believe he had lost control of his life so quickly, but for Alexander, this moment was crucial. He knew that this aggressor could not be allowed to get away unpunished. Did you think your actions would have no consequences? Alexander said, and his voice became even firmer. He turned to the policeman who had arrived on the scene. I insist on an investigation. This man must answer for his actions. The uniformed man nodded and walked toward Jack, who was now struggling to stand on his feet, as if trying to pull himself together. He realized what he had lost, but now it was too late. Everything he had done, and all his words, could not bring back his former confidence. The law was on the woman's side, and he understood that. Alexander turned to the policeman. This man should be arrested. I demand that he be brought to justice, not just for racism, but for physical violence. He pushed my mother into the road, and if it wasn't for a miracle, she could have been hit by a car. This is a crime that cannot go unpunished. The policeman looked at Alexander carefully, his eyes becoming more intense as he glanced at Jack, who stood with his head down, trying to avoid the man's gaze. We'll take all measures, the policeman said, turning to Jack. You're in custody. I want you to come with us to testify. You will not only be held accountable for your racist remarks, but also for physical violence. Your actions endangered a man's life, and now you will have to answer for that. Jack took another step back, his face contorted with fear, but he couldn't get away. His freedom now depended not on his will, but on the law. He tried to justify himself, but the words wouldn't come out, and he didn't know how to avoid this fall. He stood before the policeman like a criminal, realizing the gravity of his actions. I didn't mean it, he tried to say, but his words sounded pathetic and hollow. I didn't mean to push her. It wasn't like that. Alexander stepped forward, his gaze shrewd and hard. So you didn't mean to, huh? But you also didn't want to insult my mother when you confronted her. You didn't want to threaten her life when you pushed her into the road. You didn't want to humiliate her by calling her names and insulting her just because she wasn't like you. Did you think there would be no consequences for your actions? His voice became like cold metal with no compassion in it. Jack settled down. His knees buckled, and he stood up, leaning against the car to keep from falling. He realized that his excuse was now meaningless. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, as he tried to present it. This was a real crime, violent, racist, humiliating, and a threat to human life. The policeman continued. You're charged with assault, racial discrimination, and endangering life. Come on, let's go. He gestured for Jack to get into the police car, and Jack, seeing that he could not escape punishment, obediently walked toward it in silence. Alexander stood watching the proceedings with such determination that there was not the slightest doubt that he would not let this man go until he was punished. This isn't just a conflict, Jack, Alexander said, not taking his eyes off him. This is a serious crime, and you will have to answer for every word and action. Never forget that there are people who are not afraid to fight for justice. You will be punished, and justice will prevail. As soon as the car with Jack pulled away, Alexander turned to his mother. She hugged him, still shaken, and a look of relief came over her face. Thank you for being there for me, she whispered, feeling her heart calm down. Alexander nodded. You're safe, Mom, and no one will ever do this to you again. That man has already been punished for his crimes. The law is just. As soon as the video of the incident hit the web, it quickly went viral. At first, it was just a few posts on social media, but soon thousands of users started sharing the footage, and the news picked up on the incident. The picture didn't need any comments, everything was in plain sight. Aggression, violence, racism. People who viewed the footage could not believe their eyes. The outrage was so strong that all the networks were filled with hashtags demanding justice for the woman who almost became a victim of violence. At first, Jack couldn't believe that the video had gained such popularity. He thought his actions, despite the punishment, would be a thing of the past, but now it was clear that his actions would face not only the law, but also fierce public condemnation. You don't realize what you've done, Jack, one of his colleagues said when he saw the video on his phone screen. It's not just a scandal. It's not just your name in the mud. You've destroyed your career. Jack stood in the office, trying to justify himself, but all his explanations sounded pathetic. His co-workers, all of them, turned away from him, and those who used to support him now avoided his company. They couldn't believe that someone they had once considered a normal guy had turned out to be such a person. In an instant, he had become a symbol of aggression and prejudice, and now any excuse for his behavior sounded like empty verbiage. Active discussions started in social networks. Users post their opinions, analyzing every detail of the video. Some post records of previous incidents in which Jack had shown racist views, while others expressed complete protest against his actions. The picture from the video spread to every corner of the web and every face. Look, word became part of what has now become a public discussion. How could you do such a thing? Wrote one of the users. This man should be held fully responsible for his actions. Horrible. How can this happen in the 21st century? Others were just as strongly in favor of review. My grandfather always said, you reap as you sow. This guy's getting what he deserves. No amount of apologizing is gonna bring him back. That's when the layoffs and fired work contracts started coming in. Jack worked in a large company where he was responsible for several important projects, but because of public condemnation, the management decided to terminate his contract. He lost his job, and his professional reputation was destroyed overnight. Even his friends began to look at him differently. A few calls from old acquaintances and colleagues sounded like a verdict. Have you seen this video? Wrote one of his former friends in private messages. I thought you were a normal guy, but there's just no excuse for this. Jack Saturday in his apartment, surrounded by empty bottles and old papers. He tried to concentrate, to read the news, but all he came across were comments, accusations, and outrage. Everything that had once been his life was now turning into a nightmare, and he didn't know how to get out of it. He tried to find an excuse again, but it was getting harder and harder. He realized that his actions had not only ruined his reputation, but had truly put an end to his career. People had not forgotten what he had done, and now his name was synonymous with hatred and aggression. However, This was not enough for many. This man should be punished not only by the law, but also by society. Activists who started organizing protests wrote in comments, "Racism, violence, humiliation that must be paid for." The public judgment meted out by the internet community was merciless. Amid a national wave of protests for human rights and equality, Jack became a symbol of how rash actions can destroy destiny. But unlike the trial, where his actions were deemed violent and racist, the community did not forgive such misdeeds or give him a second chance. Each new post about Jack became even more humiliating. Former colleagues shared screenshots of his old correspondence where he used racist language, publicly condemning people who differed from him on racial grounds. These revelations only increased public outrage. "He was just a beast," people wrote, "and such people have no place among us." Soon Jack realized that his life was already changed forever. Every day it became more and more difficult to leave the house. Because he was always met with stares of judgment, he lost the opportunity to be a part of society. Colleagues, friends, and acquaintances turned away from him. It was a verdict that was given without any further ado, and it was the beginning of the end for his life. When Jack looked in the mirror for the last time, he didn't recognize himself. In front of him stood a man who had once been proud of his attitude to life, confident that he was right, but now he was nothing but a lost, humiliated, and devastated man. Realizing that his hatred had destroyed everything he had ever had, he had lost not only his job and friends, but himself. His life had been ruined in an instant, but the consequences of his actions would haunt him for a long time. The community that had once considered him a normal person now turned its back on him. His name became synonymous with aggression, racism, and violence, and every mention of him in the news or on social media reminded everyone again and again what bias and cruelty lead to. Even in the quietest corners of his life, even in his home where he tried to find refuge, he felt a heavy atmosphere of judgment. The man realized that he could not hide from his guilt, that he would not be forgiven for his words and actions. He came to the realization that his entire former life with its views, beliefs, and biases had shattered. He couldn't justify what he had done, and now it was probably too late to change anything. But at the other end of the story was a woman, Alexander's mother, whom Jack pushed onto the road. Unlike him, she became a symbol of resilience and dignity, a person who was supported by the entire community. Instead of being destroyed by the incident, she became an inspiration to others, an example of the importance of not giving in to aggression, of not allowing violence to rob one's dignity. From the beginning, her son stood by her side, ready to defend. He was not only her support, but he became an advocate for all those who face bias and racism. His actions in that moment served not only as a defense for his mother, but also as a lesson to all who watched the incident. His determination, his tough words and actions, his refusal to tolerate injustice were an important step towards change. The situation in which Jack lost everything, and the woman gained the support and solidarity of the community, served as a powerful lesson. A lesson that hatred has no future. Every act of racism, violence, humiliation, even if it seems small or insignificant, can have devastating consequences for everyone. And often those consequences don't come immediately, but they are inevitable. As Jack sat alone in his devastated home, he realized that nothing would ever be the same. While the woman, despite the pain endured from his cruelty, received support and respect from everyone who saw her holding her own in the world. Society proved not only impartial in its judgment, but also ready to support those who face oppression. People have become a united front against aggression and racism, reminding everyone that strength is in unity and that tolerance and understanding are not just words, but principles on which the future is built. It was clear to Jack that his selfishness and contempt for people different from him had cost him not only his reputation but his own humanity. His lesson was simple but hard. Hate not only destroys the lives of others, but also turns the one who sows it into a faceless shadow. And for the woman and her son, it was a testament to the strength of spirit and the importance of supporting each other in times when the world seems unfair. A story that began with cruelty ended with kindness and justice triumphing. And the most important lessons it left behind were that we all, despite our differences, must respect each other and fight for justice, each to the best of our ability. And, dear viewers, we want to hear your opinion about what you have just read. What do you think could have changed the outcome of this story if people had intervened earlier? Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? How did you handle these situations? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Each and every one of you is incredibly valuable to us, and we are truly grateful to have you with us. You help us grow and develop this channel, and your support is what inspires us to keep creating new stories for you. Don't forget to give us a like if you like the video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos. We really appreciate your activity and attention. We wish you a good day filled with only positive moments.